Hello, welcome back. So this lecture is on more about the interaction of the Spanish Empire and the Native Americans. Um, Much of it was very ugly. As you can see in this scene here, we have someone's limbs being hacked off. As we'll see, that was a penalty for not bringing back enough gold to the Spanish so that they could bring it back to their country. So uh, a fair amount of ugliness, but also we will feature some of the work of the Franciscan friars, the Order of St. Francis, and what seemed, in some cases, to be some sincere attempts to sort of help uh, the Native Americans as well and defend them against uh, the authorities, Spanish authorities. So, into it. So Columbus arrives in the Caribbean, and he noticed that the native people, the Taínos, some of them wore gold and silver jewelry, and sort of took that to mean that there was a vast amount of gold on the islands. Um, Probably, definitely, mostly wishful thinking, right? So Columbus returns to Spain, promising, right, Ferdinand and Isabella, uh, vast quantities of gold and silver, right? I'm going to give me enough money to go back. I'll bring you back ships full of gold. Um, So he comes back a second time and finds that his promise is actually hard to keep, right? So yeah, there was some gold. Um, it was mostly found just, in rivers and streams and small little bits. There weren't any, huge stockpiles of gold or any large veins. They did establish some silver mines. Um, and what he did was order the Taino people to, each person had to bring a certain quantity of gold back, and if they did not, then they were punished severely, which included cutting off limbs, as we saw in the previous. And so they established some silver mines, and right, the native people there were forced to work in the silver mines under fairly brutal conditions. You would probably call it slavery. Um, you know, Colum these days, many people do not celebrate Columbus Day for many of these reasons. And much of what Columbus did was fairly brutal and racist. But at any rate, that was what was going on. So throughout, North and South America, between the Spanish and the Portuguese, uh, they were able to relatively easily establish sort of military dominance, at least on the coast. Um, and part of that was, more advanced weaponry. You'll recall uh, that the Maya only had stone tools and not been sort of even obviously this is much later than the Maya, but still they did not have steel. The natives they did not have gunpowder. They didn't have horses. So the Spaniards did have military superiority, and even more devastating were the microorganisms that they brought along with them. So you'll recall that the Native Americans didn't have a lot of sort of herd animals around. It was limited largely to like ducks and bees, right? And dogs. So exposure to sheep and pigs, right, and all of the bacteria and the viruses that they carry over generations, Europeans had resistance to a fair number of different microorganisms that people in the Americas had no resistance to whatsoever. So disease ravaged the Native American community for sure, like literally dropping it by a factor of 10, right? It's hard to say exactly what the population was before uh, they encountered Europeans, but there's estimates that populations dropped from like 25 million to 2.5 million fairly quickly. Um, Pardon me, I had to sneeze there. So, with the native population dropping like a rock, there was much less labor for the agricultural colonies that they were planning to do, the Spanish were planning to do, in addition to just trying to extract silver. Um, it took some time to figure out what the sort of the best crop was. It ended up being sugar. being the easiest to grow and the most profitable, um, but without a large labor force because most of them, the vast majority of them, had died from European diseases. Um, this was the impetus to capture slaves from the African continent, bring them over to work the sugarcane. Um, and this is a Jared Diamond, who was, I don't know if he's still at UCLA, he was at UCLA at one point, a historian, has, advanced the guns, germs, and steel sort of theory of like how Europeans came to sort of dominate um, the world at a certain point. And he thinks those are the main things, right? The advanced weaponry and then also all this um, resistance to disease and the ability to bring diseases over to other continents. But at least Burbank and Cooper argue that this is not really the whole story. So, for example, you'll often hear the story of, the Aztecs being conquered by 600 Europeans, and the Inca by 300 Europeans. And those numbers are misleading. Sure, there were only a few hundred Europeans, but what really happened was, so say the Aztecs, they, compared to the Maya, they were relatively new civilization, relatively new power, and they didn't have complete consolidated power over, all of Mexico. Uh, they had many rivals, and so the Europeans managed to get their rival Native American powers on their side to fight the Aztecs and the Incas. So, in fact, it wasn't just right 300 or 600 Europeans against an entire Aztec army. It was 300 or 600 Europeans plus a bunch of other Native Americans against the Aztec army. Actually, the numbers were relatively matched, and even then, often the battles were quite hard fought. There were definitely like European losses and setbacks before an ultimate victory. So it was not exactly as the impression some people give is that having guns and horses, they just trampled the Aztecs easily. That wasn't quite the case. They had to team up with a lot of other native people, and it was a difficult, uh, but they did ultimately. Europeans ultimately did prevail. So, having conquered the Aztecs and the Incas, um, the Spanish used a tried and true method of empire, which is to preserve the existing, physical and political infrastructure, right? They know that there's large labor forces. They needed people, right? They needed labor. Um, there was already a hierarchy and a nobility that had a certain amount of influence over this labor force. And so rather than just destroy all these people and kill them all and destroy the cities, the Spanish made deals with the local elites, right? Okay, you can keep your power, you can keep some privilege, but you need to intercede with us, the masses, and we need people to work fields and silver mines and so on, right? So these intermediaries kept their positions of power by making sure that lots of tribute, right, that sort of a heavy amount of goods were extracted and delivered to the Europeans. And this was not easy, right, because their populations were devastated by disease, so they had to work out systems where it's each man in the area would work in silver mines 1 year out of seven or something like that. Um, and as always with intermediaries, as we've seen, there's always the danger from the viewpoint of the Europeans that they'll break off, rebel, try to run their own operation, and this frequently happened. There were frequent rebellions, which in this case fairly understandable when the living in is basically slavery. So mestizaje. So the colonists were largely men, right? They came over from Europe, and they were gonna want to, many of them, meet women, habit with women, marry them, sometimes probably assault them. I mean, assault them, right? Uh, and children were the result of these marriages or assaults or just, romances or whatever, all the wide varieties of human sexual interaction. Children would result, and these were known as mestizos or mixed. So uh, being mestizo didn't mean that you were necessarily consigned to a lower socioeconomic status. Some of them gained fairly high status. One example, Garcilaso de la Vega, who was the son of a conquistador and an Inca princess, so both parents of relatively high status, just from different civilizations. And he became a historian of the Inca Empire. Um, so there definitely was mixing, a fair amount of it, but it was, for the most part, um, the exception. It was a segregated society for sure, right? So native people lived among themselves under conditions, again, that could be described as slavery. Then, as African slaves began to populate the islands as well, they would sometimes escape their enslavement, right? Would also intermarry with native people, uh, other sorts of right, sexual contact, raped by Europeans or marrying Europeans. So again, so you had mixing not only of Native American and European, but also with the people as well. So, I said it was in a sense relatively easy. I mean, it was, a battle, but ultimately the Europeans did come to dominate militarily. But really, this is mainly the case around the coast. Further inland, right, in the lowlands, the jungles, it was much more difficult to project power and maintain a force, right, the deeper you went. So the central lowlands of South America were still largely under Native American control. The Spanish would go in and make raids, but there's really no lasting projection of power in there. And then you contact with the Europeans meant that eventually the Native Americans were going to get horses, right? They were going to learn different weapon systems, and the technological imbalance started to become less extreme, and so this just makes it even more difficult for the Spanish to really control the continent. Um, so the systems they had for control was the encomienda system. So a European sort of governor leader would be granted um, the emperor would grant some European the right to extract the wealth from some group of Native Americans, right? So he'd say, here, these are your people. Literally, it was sort of a grant of people from the Europeans, which is uh, pretty pretty messed up if you think about it, right? So it says, okay, you can do what you want to extract wealth using these people, right? Um, so part of the deal was that Spanish crown, one of these people converted to Catholicism. So as the Encomin I think I even misspelled it, right? So encomendero, I know I misspelled that. Encomendero, I did spell it right. Um, no, yeah, close enough. There's an I there. Okay, I misspelled it. There's an I there. There should be an E. That's what's throwing me. So the encomendero, right, who was the person who received the grant from the crown, that says, hey, you can basically exploit this group of people. Right? Part of his job was to convert those native people to Catholicism. Um, so schools were developed, and a bit later in the lecture, we'll talk about the Franciscans who did much of the work of converting and teaching Native Americans Catholicism. You can imagine that the priority of the encomendero was more on extracting profit, right, and a little less concerned about the religious part. Um, Again, how successful the system was, and as far as like really dominating the entire continent, it's limited, but it did succeed in some degree in breaking up the existing political units of the Native Americans, right? So now they were forced to live in sort of units that were dictated by the Spanish crown, and that did sort of break up some of the bonds and the alliances and allow the Spanish to exert a bit more control. But there is this sort of obvious tension, right, between these two aims of the Spanish Empire, which is to extract as much wealth as possible, right, from these lands and these people, and then also um, to spread Christianity, right, which was, we recall in the Roman Empire very popular among the poor and the oppressed, right, and because you know the words of Jesus are um, meant to be of comfort and support and uh, to the poor, right? So there's definitely this tension there, and some of the missionaries were quite aware of it and quite sincere in their conviction that they were there to help the Native Americans and to push back against the greed and violence of the Spanish Empire and the encomend- encomendero system. I don't know why that's so hard for me to say. Um, so there were different. So Dominicans were one group of friars that came. We're focusing on the Franciscans here because I think they're a particularly devout and particularly sincere, many of them at least. So I don't know if you're aware of Saint Francis or the stories of Saint Francis. So he's known um, as a sort of a preacher of love. He's known as hum, a preacher of humility and also of love of nature and of animals. And this was sort of the general vibe, right, of monks. And so it takes a certain type of person, right, to imagine this, right? You're living in Spain and you decide to leave your home. So first of all, you decided to commit your life to being a monk, right? So you're not going to marry, you're not going to have children, you're going to devote your life to God, right? And you go to live in the monastery. And then now you decide, I'm going to leave the safety of my monastery. I'm going to undertake this dangerous expedition, right, to a completely new world, right, filled with people that don't speak my language. I'm going to go out largely by myself. There were very few of these missionaries out there. They tended to travel in pairs, right? So you were largely unprotected, um, would have to learn to communicate with the native people, right? And you can't expect these native people are going to be exactly happy to see you at the beginning, right? Their experience with European people is largely negative. It's a very dangerous undertaking that you would have to be fairly sincere to want to undertake with no real promise of, you know, making money or even that you would survive. And as I say, sort of the virtues and the tenets and the philosophy behind the Franciscan order was very much a traditional Christianity that was stood in sort of fairly deep contrast to the colonial attitude, which was violent, mad for gold, right? Fairly rapacious. So it's an interesting contrast, and it's a nice sort of like palate cleanser after all of the violence and ugliness, right? So there were other orders, um, other monks that had missions that sent missionaries to the Americas. As I mentioned, the Dominicans, so they had traveled to the Caribbean, where Columbus had first landed, and where the much of the sugar cane cultivation happening. Um, but when they got there, basically what they were faced with was, so again, they come to the Americas thinking, look at all these people, they've never heard the word of God, right? They've never heard about Christianity. We're going to bring all these souls to God, right? We're going to save all these souls. What they saw was um, just people dying left and right. Again, as I said, population going from 25 million to 2 million, right? So 90% uh, dying, right? So a bit shocking and a bit um, hopeless. You would feel a bit hopeless, right? So they thought they were going to save a lot of souls. What they did see is a lot of souls being lost. So now the Franciscans were operating in Mexico, right? And they had the benefit that, so this is where the Aztecs were. So it was already a large, advanced, highly religious as the Aztecs had their own religion. Um, and ultimately, right, the form of Christianity that gets established there still to this day has mixes much of the native religion in with it, right? Franciscans we'll see, weren't particularly dogmatic about making sure that that the natives renounce their old ways and embrace brand new Christian ways. If there was any way that they could make Christianity make sense to the people, even if it meant, in terms of like understanding it through their old religion, they were kind of fairly open to that, right? Um, so the Franciscans also had the benefit of Cortez, who was in charge there, um, hoped to employ a different approach than what was going on in the Caribbean. Uh, he actually asked the emperor to allow the Franciscans a bit more authority to operate as they wanted to, and to sort of go out there and convert the local population and prepare them to become incorporated. So, literally, the first shipment of Franciscans was 12 dudes, right? So, um, symbolizing the original 12 apostles, right? Um, but it's a astonishingly small number, right, to try to go out and convert our continent. Um, More Franciscans arrived later, but the number never grew to more than a few hundred in the entire country. So it certainly was not the case that they just went out and convinced people, right, using reason or appeals to emotion or whatever, and people voluntarily converted to Christianity. This was required. So it was coercive for sure, right? Um, so the locals were required to go to church, right, and they were required to go to religious school. And there was limited communication between the Franciscans and the native people. So the religious education took a fairly just, I don't know, you think of Christianity, right, as this very internal thing where I confess my sins, like a direct relationship with God in many, orders, and it's about coming to believe these other things, all these internal things, right? And much less in contrast to the old pagan ways where you did sacrifices and a lot of much more. Well, the Franciscans adapted, right? And they didn't worry too much about what was going on in the hearts of the native people, and they just taught them to kneel at the right times during the service, repeat the prayer even if they didn't understand the words, right? So, for example, uh, so the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, right, which in Latin is Pater Noster, Our Father, right? Um, well, in the Aztec language, the closest words for Pater Noster were the words for flag and prickly pear, the fruit of the cactus. So the natives would like trying to, in their school, learn these prayers. They'd literally draw a little flag and a little prickly pear fruit. They could remember Pater Noster, even though those has nothing to do with the actual meaning of the Latin words, right? So again, adapting to whatever they could do, right? Uh, they the Franciscans weren't too dogmatic about what form this sort of religious education. Baptism is obviously a very external thing. You don't have to understand what a baptism is necessarily to be baptized. Um, and so they did a lot of baptisms, sometimes thousands in one day, right? Um, they did it with a fair amount of urgency because, again, Native people were still dying of disease at these incredible rates, trying to baptize as many people as they could before they died, right? And try to get these souls to heaven. The Franciscans also often fought for the political interests of the native people. So again, they were natives were being forced to convert to Christianity, um, and the Franciscans were interested in that part. But the Franciscans weren't particularly interested in extracting wealth from these people, and so they pushed back on the encomenderos and interceded with the king to try to have the work quotas reduced on these native people, right? And it was generally just a very physically exhausting existence for these friars. So again, there were very few of them. They were traveling wide distances, um, right across jungle, and then There might be one or two that did many jobs in a single village. So they would have to preach sermons, often in several different languages. So the same sermon back to back in three different languages, baptize a bunch of people, take confession, bury the dead, all of this in one day, right? From dawn to dusk, working at doing this religious work. When they couldn't influence the encomenderos to stop the violence and reduce the workloads, they would appeal directly to the king, right, to the crown, and complain, right, when an encomendero was too violent with with people. So this was a dangerous existence as well, right? So there were very few of them. They were dispersed widely, right? So you have one or two friars in each village. The villages were fairly spread out because you'll recall the slash and burn agriculture. This is still the thing, right? So you had to move from plot of land to plot of land, um, plots staying becoming unusable for several years in between. So the villages were fairly spread out. Um, and they were largely alone, the only Europeans, for miles and miles. Um, so if the local chief decided they didn't like you or decided to, to make a revolt, you were certainly in danger as a Franciscan friar. One example, right? So a couple native boys warned a couple friars in one of these remote villages that there was going to be a revolt. So I guess the chief was upset that they refused to baptize him until he had freed his slaves, right? Um, So the chief planned to revolt. He planned to burn down the church and the friars with him. Um, well, they managed to hold out and prevent the church from being burned. Luckily for them, some Spanish soldiers happened to be in the area and arrived the next day. Um, and even so, the friars sort of interceded for the rebels, convinced the soldiers not to pardon them and not to execute them or punish them, right? And so maybe this is a little propaganda for the Franciscans. Who knows, how these stories get around, right? But at least this is the idea that they were really trying to sort of live a Christ-like existence of not holding grudges and not harming people. They were also in danger from the local Spanish. So these friars again were often pushing against the encomenderos, snitching onto the king, right, on these if they were going beyond the legal bounds in their exploitation of the natives. And so they would often protest the legal system, right? So the legal system was very biased, right, against the Native Americans. So, you know, killing a Native American, the penalties were less than that of stealing a horse. So um, that's sort of the last slide. I wanted to paint a little bit of a picture of this interaction, right? We had the Spanish Empire in the last lecture. We talked about how it was kept alive, Charles V, by the wealth that was coming from the Americas, and I wanted to get a little closer look at what that looked like, right? Uh, Imagine there was a lot of violence, um, and it was uh, not a pleasant existence for the Native Americans, but there were some spots of kindness and actual sort of like sincere Christian sentiment mixed in there. Um, so interesting stuff. We can only sort of touch on it a bit. We'll be moving on to other subjects in the next lectures, and I'll see you then.